Alright, welcome back. So I decided to just make a new video to talk about this next principle. I didn't want to make the previous video too long. So a lot of this is actually a new section which I didn't really talk about in the book. I alluded to some of these principles in the book, but I just wanted to make a specific video to talk about this. So yeah, the principle. So in this principle, we're going to talk about something, and I just kind of made this up here. We're going to talk about kind of a concept of feedback, right, between the conscious mind and the body. So just to be clear, I think it was probably clear last video, but I'm just going to say it just to make it absolutely clear. Because in the last video we basically talked about how the subconscious compels the mind and it compels the body. Now it should be obvious, or should be understood that the conscious mind doesn't. When the conscious mind produces an intention, right, and it causes the subconscious to become quantized and produce a compulsion, that compulsion doesn't only affect the conscious mind, right? Similarly, when the body commands the subconscious and the subconscious produces a compulsion in response to that, that doesn't only affect the body, right? So, in other words, when the conscious mind commands the subconscious, it'll produce a compulsion that affects both the conscious mind and the body, right? When the body commands the subconscious, it produces a compulsion that affects the body and the conscious mind. So, in other words, in a sense, and that's what I get to here, the health of the conscious mind and the body depend on each other through subconscious compulsion. So if the body is telling the subconscious to do something, right, what it does is it's gonna compel the conscious mind in response to that command from the body. And sometimes that compulsion is very bad, or it's very negative, or it's a bad experience for the conscious mind. So the conscious mind isn't the one causing that compulsion, right? It's the body. So the conscious mind, in a sense, would want to tell the body to stop doing that, right? Because it's not feeling well as a result of it. And by the same token, when a person has stress, so we talked about that before, if the person has a prolonged negative way of thinking and it continuously charge the subconscious at a negative frequency, that's going to compel the body, and the body will change over time, and it's going to have problems with its health, right? Again, which we call stress. And the body would tell the mind to stop thinking negatively. So in other words, like I said, the health of the conscious mind and the body depend on each other, right? So they kind of have to work as a team to kind of get it right. If one of those two parts of yourself, or that make up who you are kind of not working properly and not doing what they're supposed to do, it's going to impact the other part of yourself, right? And it can create a negative experience. So in other words, the body's vulnerable to compulsions that are induced by the conscious mind, and the conscious mind is vulnerable to compulsions induced by the body. So I just kind of give an example of that here. So this was also something I forgot to say. I alluded to it again, but I just want to say it to make it a little more clear. So for example, when a person is addicted, right? When a person's addicted, what's happening is their brain keeps commanding their subconscious to switch to the frequency of wanting or yearning for something. And on that frequency, the subconscious compels the conscious mind to want something, right? And so it alters that person's perception when it's really highly charged, right? It very powerfully alters a person's perception to want the thing it's addicted to. So that could be drugs, but it could also be food, right? It can be an experience or an activity. So really you can get addicted to anything. But just in this case specifically, we're going to talk about drugs. So when the body is continuously charging the subconscious at that frequency of yearning, right, a person's mind will be very powerfully altered. So getting the drug seems like the most logical and rational thing in the world to them, right? Thoughts that make it sort of make sense to get the drug are easy to keep in your mind, and thoughts that make it seem illogical to get the drug are harder to keep in your mind. So that's why when people are addicted, they do the craziest things to try to get the drug, because their perception and what's rational to them becomes altered. The more addicted they are, the more powerful that alteration is. And so, I've seen people do crazy things for drugs when I was growing up, but this is basically where it's coming from. So the body, the conscious mind, is really at the it's at the mercy of this subconscious charge coming from the body, right? But also that leads to this point as well, which this was also something I alluded to. Some of these ideas I'm so used to, I forget that, as I'm teaching it, I have to explain it. So I forget to even mention some of these things. But in the book, it's a little more, because I could easily edit that, and I've been writing it for years. And I've reread it like probably 100 times, right? There aren't as many things that it's a little more complete in certain ways. Because sometimes in these videos I forget stuff. But yeah, so this is something that like I said, I alluded to, but it's a good idea to speak on it more clearly. A compulsion induced by the body alters the perception of the conscious mind and increases its affinity to produce an intention at a similar frequency, which is kind of what we talked about in the concept of mental takeover, right, in chapter 4. So this creates a charging feedback loop. So what I'm basically saying here is when your body commands your subconscious to switch to a certain frequency, on that frequency, your subconscious will compel your conscious mind. And that compulsion is going to cause your conscious mind, your perception will be altered in a way that's aligned with that frequency. And from that altered state of perception, you're more likely to produce an intention that matches that frequency, right? So for example, this was obvious to see with primal emotions. That's why I spoke about it in the section on mental takeover. So if I produce the anxiety frequency, right, or my body charges my subconscious at the anxiety frequency, right, my mind becomes altered, right, to perceive things as a threat to me. I feel the emotion of anxiety, but I'm also more likely to produce an intention at the anxiety frequency, right? So that's just what happens when your subconscious is on a frequency and compels your subconscious. The compulsion will make it so that it seems rational to produce attention that matches that frequency. So when that happens, and I produce that intention of anxiety, I keep charging the anxiety frequency. So that's kind of the idea, and that's why the body will usually only charge a primal emotion for a short time, but it expects the conscious mind to kind of take over the charge as a result of that principle. Same thing with sexual energy, same thing with the danger emotion. Aggression is another primal frequency that I don't think I mentioned. That's kind of one I learned a little later. But aggression is kind of similar to the anger frequency, but not exactly. But yeah, that's another type of primal emotion, I believe. So yeah, the process of mental takeover is basically when if the body charges a particular frequency, the conscious mind has a tendency of taking over that charge, and it'll start producing attention at that same frequency and just charging that frequency itself. So now this is important in this whole framework of a long-term charge, because if the body tells, so for example, addiction, right? If the body is telling the subconscious or commands the subconscious to want something, right? And the conscious mind on that frequency produces intention to want something too, well, that intention is going to charge the body, is going to cause the subconscious to not only stay at that frequency or hover around that frequency, it's going to cause it to charge up at that frequency. But here's what happens. If the conscious mind keeps doing that and it keeps charging at that frequency, what happens? That frequency charge is going to eventually impact the body. So as it stays at a higher level of intensity for a long period of time, the body will start to change in a way that reflects that frequency. So if it's addiction, for example, the brain chemistry will start to change a little to facilitate addiction, in other words. So the brain chemistry will change in a way that favors charging the subconscious at the addiction frequency. But if the brain charges the subconscious even more powerfully or more easily at the subconscious frequency of addiction or related to addiction, that compulsion that on the conscious mind is going to get even stronger. And if the conscious mind doesn't resist, it always has free will, but if it doesn't resist, now it's going to continue to produce intention, and now the subconscious is going to charge even more, which causes the body to change again. And so you see it's a loop, right? And so that's why I say it creates a charging feedback loop. So this is important. This is something that I think scientists and people who study neuroscience, because they always ignore metaphysics, they don't realize that this is what happens. This is very, very important. You can create a charging feedback loop between your mind and your body. Now, if that charging feedback loop is positive, which is where the placebo effect comes in, then that's a wonderful thing. No problems. But this is very bad when the charging feedback loop is negative, because it's not going to be easy to break that loop right quickly, right? Because it's going to kind of be like, in physics, it's called a potential well, right? So it's like you're going down the well, right, or down the hill, and then you have to climb out of that hill. It takes almost, because of gravity, it takes very little energy to go down a hill. It takes a lot of energy to go up a hill, right? At the bottom of the hill is where you're most stable, right? So it takes virtually no energy to stay at the bottom of the hill. It takes a lot of energy to get up the hill. And so that can happen as a result of this feedback loop effect, right? So when a person's addicted, if they keep giving into that addiction, then their attention will charge the subconscious at the frequency associated with the addiction. And then as it continues to charge and stays charged up, it'll change the body to facilitate that addiction. The body will just charge the subconscious even more to be addicted. And then the conscious mind will charge it even more again, right? And it's a feedback loop. And when a person finally decides they want to break the addiction, it's really hard, right? Because not only is the subconscious compelling them very strongly to keep producing the intention that sustains the addiction, and keep thinking and seeing things in ways that sustain the addiction or make it seem rational and logical to do, but also the body's doing it. So even if the conscious mind wants to stop, the body's not going to stop. That's going to take time. So the body's going to keep charging it too. And so it can be very, very, very difficult to avoid those feelings, right? Because that's what I mean by you're down the well. You're at the bottom of the well. It takes a while to climb out. So you can be like at the bottom of the potential well, subconsciously or metaphysically. And that is what happens when people have depression and anxiety. So when the body is constantly charging the subconscious, let's take anxiety. When the body is constantly charging the subconscious to feel anxious, right? It'll compel the conscious mind in a way that tries to get it to principle of mental takeover to happen, right? So it wants the conscious mind to also produce intention at or around the anxiety frequency. And just to go through it again, if the conscious mind does that and keeps doing that, which is what happened to me during the experience I told you guys about, I did it intentionally, and then I fell in this feedback loop, which I didn't know was a thing at the time. But if the conscious mind keeps producing that intention, then the subconscious will charge even more at the anxiety frequency. And as it charges more, it'll stimulate that primal emotion, because the body reads which frequency you're on, and primal emotions, the body will respond with a spike of charge if you go to that frequency of something being a threat to you, which the anxiety frequency is. And so when it goes on that frequency, when your body goes to the anxiety frequency, your body reads that frequency, and then it responds by trying to charge that primal emotion. So the subconscious charges more, and then the subconscious compels the conscious mind to produce an intention at that frequency, and then it does, and it charges more, and then that response causes the subconscious to continue or maybe even charge a little bit more at the anxiety frequency, and then the conscious mind will do it again. If it doesn't, it has free will, so it can choose to resist, but if it doesn't, because it's hard to, because it's being compelled, and the compulsion keeps getting stronger and stronger, right, it'll just keep charging the subconscious at the anxiety frequency as the subconscious charges for a prolonged period of time. So this is not like a day or two, right? This is going to be like weeks or months. It can have, again, it depends on the intensity. Primal emotions are a little different, but I'd probably say, yeah, it can actually, if you keep doing this nonstop for days, you will start to see much stronger effects. So you can really get deeper into that potential energy well. But for anxiety, if your conscious mind keeps charging it, then your body's going to change more and more and more to make it easier to charge, right? And this kind of has to do with the law of manifestation, which we'll talk about all the way at the end of book 2, but that's kind of the principle here. This is just a manifestation of it in the body. But yeah, so that anxiousness feedback loop will make it's just going to cause your body to change more and more and more and more. And you go deeper into that hill. And so this is what happens when a person has generalized anxiety disorder. Now, there are different things in the body that can start causing it to try to make you anxious, but the conscious mind needs to not listen to that, right? If the conscious mind does, which it's hard to, right? Because because medical science doesn't pretend there's no metaphysics. They never tell people not to do this, right? They do tell them to change the way they think and change their behavior, but they don't tell them this, right? This is important because when the conscious mind just knows how to charge the energy, it has a much more practical plan of action to solve this problem. But because people don't really know this stuff, right? They may still very often give in to the compulsion or give in to the urge, which is like it's like when you're dieting and you really, really want to not eat something, but you're given the urge to eat. That's how it feels here. The anxiety from the charge by the body, on that frequency, the subconscious will compel you very strongly to produce an anxious thought. And every time you give into it, you basically sustain the energy level or you charge the subconscious even more. And that causes the body to change more. And then you get stuck in that charging feedback loop, which is very hard to get out. And it's basically the same principle with depression. So that's why people, sometimes they can be stuck in this loop for years, right? Nothing they do gets out. They just keep feeling anxious, right? Because they keep giving into that charge. Now, when a person takes medication to prevent this process or to break the loop what ends up happening is they'll take some medication which alters the brain, and the brain will stop charging the subconscious at the anxiety frequency. It won't do it as much, but the subconscious is still charged, right? We'll talk more about subconscious memory a little later because it can still hold the charge anyway. But usually, if the body stops charging at the anxiety frequency, then the feedback loop could be broken a little bit because the body's a little different, right? It doesn't have free will. It's just doing it's just working basically based on the chemicals in the brain. It does have kind of intelligence, but its normal intelligence generally doesn't do this unless something goes wrong. So, when a person takes medication for anxiety and the body's no longer charging the subconscious at that frequency, sometimes that's enough for the person's conscious mind to stop producing intention. Then the loop is broken, and then their depression or their anxiety is healed, right? But the conscious mind has free will. There's no magic rule that's always going to work for it anytime it involves the conscious mind. Because a person could choose to do this, or they can choose to do that. So sometimes taking medication will work, sometimes it doesn't. Because the compulsion to think anxiously or in a depressed way is still there, right? Even if you take the pill, it's just not as strong. Some people will still continue, even from that weaker compulsion, they'll still continue to give into it and think in a way that sort of puts them back in that loop, right? And when that happens, now their subconscious is just charged more and their body is changed again, but it's actually changed now even though they're taking the medication. So what ends up happening is now they need to take a larger dosage. So they need to take the larger dosage so the body stops charging the subconscious even more. But if that person's mind, in a simple sense, we'll just say if it isn't strong enough, right, to resist the urge, to give into the anxiousness frequency, to produce intentions at that frequency and charge the frequency, then they'll just get stuck in the loop again, right? They'll get stuck in the loop, the subconscious charges more, the body changes more, and it's changing even while they're taking the medication, right? So, because it's not like they take it once, they keep taking it. So it'll change with whatever level it was at with the medication. So it'll just increase again. Then they have to keep taking a larger and larger and larger doses because they're not fixing this part of it, right? And so eventually the dosage will be so high that it's dangerous. And so some people, until the doctor just won't prescribe more. And so some people, they have a very hard time getting out of the anxiousness and the anxiety disorder, right? And that's because of this feedback loop, right? Which science and medical science and doctors don't tell them about, right? They would have a much better, there's nothing a doctor can do about this part. Nothing. You know what I mean? They just have to give them the information. This is how a lot of things in metaphysics and spirituality work, right? There's nothing anyone else can do to do these parts for you, right? You have to be the one to do it. But these people, they don't know this stuff. It's not their job to know this. It's medical science's job. But they don't think metaphysics exists, so they never know about this stuff. And so a lot of times they don't give people the help that they need, at least in my opinion. Again, I'm not a doctor. You guys go to a doctor. For me, when I had this problem, right? So when I had sleep apnea, I had this problem with depression and anxiety. That was the first time I ever even realized what was actually happening with these phenomena because I had experienced it, right? So what I noticed is I took a pill and I did feel better, but I knew right away that I was gonna feel bad. Yeah, so like I said, I knew right away that I was gonna, if I kept taking that pill, actually it was gonna make my sleep apnea worse. But also, it wasn't really gonna solve the problem because the problem was in the body. It would have helped, right? It would have helped me get out this loop. But I got the bright idea, right? So I wouldn't say it like that, but I came up with the idea of, I thought if I keep charging my subconscious through the mind, which was really hard to charge as a result of this feedback loop, because it was so deep in the anxiety frequency. But I could still charge it a little tiny bit. So I was like, if I keep charging it at a specific frequency, right, a positive frequency, and I make that charge go powerful, more and more and more and more and more powerful, will it eventually overpower this charge coming from my body? And then will it eventually cause my body to start to change in response to the frequency of that charge? So because it's a positive frequency, my body's going to start charging my subconscious in a positive way, which is placebo effect. So in other words, my goal was to charge my subconscious so intensely that it overpowers the body and causes it to change in the direction of my charge of my choice, which of course is positive. So that was actually my idea. Never had to do something like that before, but I did it and it worked, right? It worked for me, right? So I'm not telling you guys to do it. I'm just saying it worked for me, right? And so it took about a month, but it did eventually work. I just kept charging more and more and more. I kept making the charge more and more and more intense because I knew this effect would eventually happen, right? And then eventually did. And now the anxiety and depression were completely gone. So yeah, I just wanted to make another video kind of talking about this. I didn't put all of this in the book. So yeah, I just wanted to make a new video talking about a little bit about this stuff because I think this is important. And like I said, when you're controlling your subconscious, you really want to know what's going on with the body, right? Because as you can see from these last couple chapters, this is a much more complete picture of the subconscious relationship between the subconscious and the conscious mind is very important in understanding what goes on with it and learning how to control it and how to charge it. So this is something I believe you'll never really see in science, is this concept of a feedback loop between the conscious mind, subconscious, and the body, which is very important. Again, they do acknowledge that negative thinking can sort of keep you in a state of depression and anxiety, but not in the way that I'm talking about here. They don't treat it like a form of energy. Subconscious energy has a transient nature to it, which means that it doesn't instantaneously change. You have to focus on the transient nature and how it changes over time, which you need these principles to fully understand it in a way that gives you a mental action plan for solving this problem, right? So yeah, I think that's pretty much it. For people who do suffer from anxiety and depression, I hope that this, at least, again, I'm not giving you guys medical advice, but I hope this kind of gives you some insight into what's happening with it, right? So when I had it, like, even though I felt the urge to think anxious or think in a depressed or hopeless way, I had to resist it because I knew that was going to charge it. Excuse me. For example, it's like, let's say you're in love, right, with a certain girl. You see her walk in the room, you will feel an urge to think about her and fantasize about her, which is transcendental imagination, and feel the love frequency. But you got to try to resist it, right? Like when you're talking to a chick you really like, you might feel an urge to kind of act funny, right? That's the frequency. That's how the subconscious is compelling you. But you have to try to resist that urge and act normal, right? That's what you got to do in this case, but it's way harder. But if you actually know how to charge the subconscious, if you do that along with charging the subconscious, I believe, at least for me, that helped. But I'm not recommending it for anyone else. So yeah, in the next video, we're going to talk a little more about dreaming, right? I think we kind of went over most of it anyway. But we'll talk a little more about it, and then we'll move on to chapter 7, right? So yeah, that's all. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.